LoveBabz, Love Talk on Babz Rose Ivy. This is Publishers Week, and not to be disappointed, another great author coming on today to talk about a domestic cookbook, which she wrote the foreword for. This cookbook was written by Malinda Russell in 1866. So today, my guest is it Rafia? Unmute yourself.
Rafia Zafar.
Rafia Zafar?
Yeah, that's fine. Rafia Zafar. My sister said Zafar, actually.
I love it. You are the Professor Emerita of English and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. And you wrote the foreword for a domestic cookbook, which was written by Malinda Russell in 1866. So I gather Malinda Russell is a Black woman.
You got it. You got it. She was the first African American woman to publish a cookbook. Until relatively recently, we thought it was a woman named Abby Fisher, who published in the 1880s out in San Francisco. But about, maybe 30 years ago or a little more, it came to the attention of a woman named Janice B. Langone, who was a bibliophile and lived in Michigan. And she came across this cook through another cookbook collector from Malinda Russell's A Domestic Cookbook. And she realized this was an amazing thing.
I want to know what's important, like what makes this so important, the fact that she's a Black woman in 1866, which we know what was going on. Right. How did she pull this off?
No, she's an incredible person, and she's an incredible person for a lot of reasons. And the first we can say is that she was unusual, not just because she was a Black woman, but she was a free Black woman from Tennessee. Wow. Who managed despite everything. Now, if we think of how hard they tried to keep African Americans who had been enslaved under their boot heel. Now, can you imagine free Black folks, people who might have been like you and me, trying to make a living, who for one reason or another had been either freed, I'm putting that in scare quotes, right? Freed by their so-called owners, or who had been born free. A lot of people don't realize that even during the height of slavery, there were many folks who had been born free for one reason or another. Sometimes people had been manumitted years ago. Some people managed to have been free for so long they didn't remember, like who was it in the family. People who came in from the West Indies, who had been emancipated one way or another, like they were after the Haitian Revolution. People came to Louisiana, which then became part of the United States after 1803. So there are various ways that people became free. It was her grandmother who had been emancipated, and then her mother, and then Malinda Russell. And both her mother and Malinda Russell were named Malinda Russell. We always think of men who name after themselves, but women did too sometimes. So
especially women who knew something about enslavement and wanted to have some ownership or agency over their children.
Exactly.
They named them after them or some similar family name to identify, to keep track.
So this is Malinda Russell. I can show you the book. You have the book, right?
I do have the book somewhere. I don't know where it is.
I'll show you my copy again, Malinda Russell. And then this is a copy of my book, which is why they had asked me Recipes for Respect. It's a book I wrote in 2000, published in 2019, because one of my long interests has been in African American writers and entrepreneurs, right? I was very curious. My first book was on 19th century African American writers, and a lot of them were people who were self-employed, who had created businesses one way or another. And so obviously someone like Abby Fisher, at that point when I was a grad school student in the 80s, people thought Abby Fisher was the first Black woman to write a cookbook. And she was working and living in San Francisco. But Malinda Russell's really fascinating because we didn't, until relatively recently, we didn't even know about. Even the great Jessica B. Harris, who is the sort of the doyen, the sort of the guiding angel for people in Black foodways, right? We've all seen read or seen High on the Hog.
Which is one of my favorite things.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly. So even when she, early on when she was doing her work, we just didn't know the book. It's not that the book didn't exist, it's just it hadn't come back up to the surface. There's only one copy that
are you
we know
kidding?
of. There's only one copy.
Really?
Yeah, that's why this is really significant, because this is her first reprint. 100 and what, almost 200, getting on close to 175 years later. So that's, I'm proud to be, I'm like wrote a forward to the second edition.
I love so what is in this cookbook? Like, would we recognize the recipes? Would we recognize them from our own families?
Well, I think some of them we would, and some of them we'd say, well, well, let's look up it. Look, I'm just opening the book randomly. So what do I open to? Chow chow. Now, who doesn't know about chow chow, particularly Southerners, right? Which is a kind of pickle that people,
Yes.
the relish, you have it on the side of your plate. And her chow chow recipe, and this is it, chow chow. 1 peck green tomatoes, half a dozen peppers, 1 dozen onions, grated horseradish, chop and scald in salt and water, drain in a sieve, put into jars, and pour spiced vinegar over it.
Oh,
That's the recipe.
okay.
What's interesting to me about not just her cookbook in the 19th century, but so many 19th and even in cookbooks even before that, is that they're templates mostly. They're guidelines. The people who read cookbooks were people that the author assumed knew about cooking already. It's not
Okay.
like today where we have like mastering the art, like Julia Child, right? Or like I don't know, B. Smith, whoever, Jessica B. Harris's early cookbooks, right? You have a head note, right? It explains what the what the recipe is about. Then you have a list of ingredients, and then you have your directions, right? And he'll say, it would take a peck of tomatoes. It might tell you then to drop them in boiling water for 30 seconds and then peel them, right? There'd be a whole list of steps. You don't get those steps. When she says pour spiced vinegar over the chopped up relish, she's assuming you know what spices to put in your pickling vinegar, right? She's thinking, now I don't have to tell that child that you need to put some cinnamon in here and maybe some mustard seeds and stuff. Garlic, maybe some dried red pepper. She's going to assume that you know this, that you completely know this.
So who published this cookbook? Like
How
who
did it?
published this?
Well, if you well, I'm going to look at if you look at her introduction, and this is what got me so interested in it, because my first book was on 19th century Black writers in before up to around the end of the Civil War, and I thought, well, who were these people? Who were them? Some of them had been enslaved, some of them had been freed. And a lot of people in the 19th century, for a variety of reasons, wrote autobiographies. And they wrote their autobiographies to convince, to persuade their white fellow, at that point, they weren't considered fellow citizens, but they know they were, right? That they were equals, that they should be freed. And a lot of these testimonies were called slave narratives. So what I found fascinating about this book is that there seemed to be a slave narrative, but she
Oh.
wasn't. But she wasn't a slave.
Mhm.
But it is a story that's in the sort of the format of the slave narrative, beginning with where she was born, who were her parents, and then like what happened to her up to the time of the book. And I
But
thought,
Rafia, even with that though, even if she was freed, what was free anyway? Like, do you know what I mean? In those particular times, like,
exactly, exactly. There was a saying that if you were enslaved, you were enslaved to like one person or one family. But if you were a free black, you were enslaved to all whites. because
Mhm.
whites, as we know from the Dred Scott decision, right? Whites, quote unquote, had no, black folks had no rights that whites were bound to respect. So if you were free, you couldn't hide behind your owner who wouldn't necessarily want to lose a valuable piece of property. So you were unprotected, right? And unless you had, made connections in the community and were left alone. Have you read Harriet Jacobs's autobiography,
Mm-mm.
Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl?
Yes.
Well, remember, her grandmother raised her, and her
Yes.
grandmother baked, she, because of her entrepreneurial skills and her cooking skills, she was, so we could think of her before Malinda Russell. They were all these women like Molly Horniblow was the real name of Harriet Jacobs's grandmother. And she was respected in her white community, right? So she was kind of protected because people knew she was. But if people didn't, or if for some reason she didn't like it, she wasn't liked, the white people in the community would have had no compunction to, if you like cross the wrong person, you could be slapped with a fine and sold into slavery, even if you had been free. So that
Mhm.
Malinda Russell was negotiating her way up through Tennessee. She had tried to go to Africa. There was that back to the colonization movement. She
Mhm.
had, and she had twice had been working. She had run her own boarding house. Was a professional cook, and she'd amassed this money. Been widowed early. She had a son who had lost the loose use of his hand. I mean, she says this in the little autobiography, that she was writing this cookbook to earn money for herself and for the support of her child. But so you say, okay, so how did she do this? She ends up in Michigan, in Paw Paw, Michigan, which was, which is in, I can do this on my hand, but you can't see it on the radio, right? People in Michigan would know it's in southwestern Michigan. Actually, it's about, I don't know, it was near where my mother grew up, Paw Paw, Michigan, or my grandfather used to call it Two Paws in grandpa humor. Um, but well, if you are a Michigander listening to this, you will recall probably that Michigan was full of little communities of formerly enslaved people, right? Because was part of the stop. There were stops on the Underground Railroad. So there were these little communities of African American people, but they were also whites who were abolitionists, who were anti-slavery. And one of them owned a printing press, and somehow he and Malinda Russell met and he published a domestic cookbook for her. So in the olden days, we didn't necessarily go to Knopf or Doubleday to publish our books. People would go to a printer, right, and arrange to have the book printed. And this was regardless of whether you were Harriet Beecher Stowe or Malinda Russell. That was how it was. Early on, you might have a subscription where you kind of go around and get people to sign up for a certain, for copies, and then you could, get that money and take it to the printer and say, here's my down payment, print 100 books, and then I'll sell them. So she went to a printer and published her cookbook. We really don't know much more about that. I've been kind of away from doing work on Malinda Russell. I've been working more on the sort of 20th and even 21st century writers and food, but black sort of issues around African Americans and food. So I'm hoping out there's someone who was digging around. I mean, people just didn't have, particularly if you're African American, there wasn't the documentation of your life that people who were not African American, right? I was just at a talk last night about Queen Mother Moore, who was
Mhm.
and there's a new biography of Queen Mother Moore by Ashley Farmer. So I went to a talk at the local bookstore. Um, but she didn't even, someone who was born in 1898. So one of the things that came up, we were talking about, is that you didn't automatically have a birth certificate. That often we know people who are Black genealogists know is that you might have, say, if you were fortunate enough to say be raised in the Catholic Church, there may be some Catholic, like diocese documents that say, oh, Zafar was born on this day and that day because she was baptized on, this day. When it would list perhaps your parents, godparents, etc. But otherwise, people, might have an entry in their family Bible. So unless your family Bible survived, you don't necessarily have documentation. You might find people in the census. I've done research on my own family, and sometimes people turn up. Sometimes their names are different. Sometimes they're um, even their racial designation might be wrong. People are some you can in the old documentation you could see MU for mulatto, which wouldn't
Mm.
necessarily mean that you had a white parent or a black parent, but just it was about that skin privilege thing, right? So if you appeared like you had, as they used to say, white admixture, you would be, considered a mulatto. And that, sadly, that would have an impact on your economic life,
Hmm.
because people would be same thing like back in the day, right? If people were enslaved, certain people who looked a certain way would be deemed acceptable enough to work within the plantation household, to be around whites. But Malinda Russell, as a free black woman, didn't have that issue, but she had the issue of wanting to support herself or just be a chef, right? Just have a career. She had a cook shop or bake shop. She ran that boarding house, and all the way she was trying to figure out how to make a life for herself, right? How do you make a life for yourself? Not only if you're a free black woman, but you're a widowed free black woman with a child. How do you like? People are not gonna, there's no SNAP now anyway, but there was no government assistance for her. People had to, for better for worse, unless you were within the community that would help you, you had to figure things out on your own. And since she had those talents, since she had that entrepreneurial skill, she thought of the next step. She said, "Well, I know their cookbooks." She's when she says in her um, she actually says this that I she says a couple of things that are really interesting. She says she cooks after the plan of the Virginia housewife, which was blanket without enough coffee. I'm silly blanking on the name of the white woman, and she doesn't give her name. I cook after the plan of the Virginia housewife, which was already a well-known cookbook in her.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So she says that's the last line. But before that, she says, I learned my trade of Fanny Stewart, a colored cook of Virginia, and have since learned that's, you can hear the sirens, you can tell I'm in New York City, going right by my house, and have since learned many new things in the art of cooking. So what's interesting is that Virginia housewife just has a title, but she calls out another black woman, right?
Hmm.
I learned, right? Like we say in the academy, cite black women. So she's citing another black woman, right? I didn't get here by myself. I didn't get here because I memorized the Virginia housewife. I learned my trade of Fanny Stewart, a colored cook of Virginia, right? She's giving
Wow.
props to the person who trained her, who she learned. Maybe she was also working in maybe she was working in Fanny Stewart's kitchen somewhere. So
Wow.
she,
But the fact that she must have been able to read and write, right?
oh
Like
yeah,
she had that ability to read well and to write well.
right. That's another thing that distinguishes her from Abby Fisher, because Abby Fisher, you can tell her voice, but Abby Fisher says right in her foreword, something along the lines of, "I have not had the benefits of an education, so people are writing this for me." So hers was a dictated cookbook,
Hmm.
because at that point, blacks and whites, one of the things that W.B. Du Bois points out in Black Reconstruction, that it was actually the schools, the idea that there would be schools in the South benefited not just black people, but white people. Only elite whites could count on having any kind of education. But with the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, you have all these schools, right? The system of public schools came about because of push for civil rights and that benefit. It's like, we can say Black history, US history, right? Because we're all, whether people want to think about it or not, we're all in this together, right? So Malinda Russell, even though she was before Abby Fisher, because of the circumstances of her life, maybe because she was two generations free, she was able to learn to read and write somehow,
Mm.
right?
I do hope somebody picks this up and follows and traces where she goes and where she ends up and
Mhm.
where is she buried and are there any descendants? What happened to her
Right,
son?
right. I'm hoping maybe now that the book is out, there's going to be somebody who said, my grandmother said that one of her like grandmothers was this woman named Malinda Russell. Do you think it's the same Malinda Russell? And maybe we'll be able to connect the dots. My colleague Gabrielle Foreman edited the autobiography or fictionalized autobiography of a woman named Harriet Wilson, and for a long whose book was also published right after the Civil War. And for a long time, people thought that Harriet Wilson just disappeared. She was also someone who was trying, again, these Black women were like, how can we support our children? She also had a child, right? And she was thought, I'm going to publish my slave narrative because someone like Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, like sold, like it was a bestseller. So people thought, well, I'm going to write this. She seemed to have disappeared, but Professor Foreman was really interested, and she enlisted the aid of a genealogist, Reginald Pitts. And together they found that Harriet Wilson actually lived for decades afterwards. She had a whole nother life as a clairvoyant, right? She ran seances. Fascinating. She stayed in the North. She married again. So hers is another fascinating story. So I like to think that maybe Malinda Russell had that kind of life, that though she drops out of the picture, seemingly, but that she went on maybe to have, kind of we'd say maybe a remarkably unremarkable life, that maybe she stayed in Michigan. Maybe she remarried. Maybe she had a little cook shop maybe not in Paw Paw, but there was another town called Covert. My mother was from South Haven. All these little towns, Cassopolis, all these little towns that maybe had Black communities that she could move to, have sort of a support network, and just live out her days. I like to think that happened, but right now we don't know. I don't think of myself as what is it, a full blown historian. I'm somebody I'm a literary historian. I look at literary culture. Um, so I'm intrigued in sort of people's textual relics, so to speak, not necessarily to everything that happens to them afterwards, because they leave a different kind of legacy for us rather than knowing she's buried here or he ended up moving to Canada or whatever. I think what is the sort of the actual legacy that we can grasp with our hands? Like look at this cookbook. Um, it's just it's a wonderful thing. She's speaking to us from the middle of the 19th century. It's so hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of someone like Malinda Russell or Abby Fisher or Frederick Douglass unless we have these texts from them, right? These writings by them, even if they say the dictated writings. Like Abby Fisher is hilarious because at one point I can even see her like mouth twitching a little as she's trying to suppress a smile, because she says in the foreword, like essentially these cookbooks are, my recipes are so clear that even a child could do them. And what I laugh and I'm thinking, and I've written about that, you can see her thinking, yeah, even you, like clueless white middle class person who doesn't know how to run a kitchen, you follow my recipes and you're going to have perfect success. So
I
she's
said, this brings
open.
me this makes me ask Rafia, is who was her audience?
Well, that's the thing. We're not sure. I don't know. I mean, Janice long gone. God, I can blanking on the again. Not enough coffee. There was a book dealer, and there are people who collect books. So the book ended up when it was found again. It was in California, if my memory is. And Janice long gone wrote one of the two, like the long historical introduction to the cookbook, like writing everything she knew about the provenance of the cookbook, Malinda Russell. Um, and write about her, like her within a frame of African American we can think of them as literary entrepreneurs. But we are assuming that the audience was people who were running households, right? The average cook, you and I wouldn't necessarily buy a cook. Books were expensive still in the 19th century, right? But
Yeah, how
these
about that?
they were, and they're getting expensive now, right? I There would be people like, I don't know, people who ran hotels or and said, I'm hiring someone, she's really good, but she knows how to make five things, right? So if you're running like a, a cook shop, or a bake shop, you might buy one of these cookbooks, right? And say, okay, this will give us 10 different recipes for plain cakes. This will give us six different, most of the recipes tended to be for desserts. I like to think um, that it's because life was so sour that there were a lot of dessert recipes. But friends of mine who are, culinary historians say, well, those were the hardest things for people to make, right? Because anyone who's a baker knows you have to be pretty precise, right? You have to know the right amount of leavening. You have to know how much to beat things. If your cake is going to rise, it has to have a certain kind of volume. And those are harder than just grilling steaks. So
Mhm.
that's one argument, that there are a lot of sweet and dessert recipes in older cookbooks because those were more difficult, right? Than just, chopping an onion and sauteing it and throwing in some, it might be different every time, but you knew basics. But to make something like a layer cake, I couldn't just go into the kitchen and say, I'm going to make a layer cake. You really you have to be an experienced cook to make a layer cake without instructions. But I think even you have to be pretty experienced to make a layer cake. People need the actual, the list of ingredients with the amounts. That's what's fascinating about the Malinda Russell. If I look again at her cookbooks, so I'm looking at a ginger pound cake, and I love
Hmm,
ginger cake. I love gingerbread.
me
But this,
too. And
then
it's
this
not
is
easy to work with. Gingerbread is very difficult.
It is, and she has different kinds. So there's some that are kind of flat. There's some kind of they're raised. So this is a ginger pound cake, and this has more specifics. 1 pint molasses, half pound sugar, half pint sour milk, 1 teaspoon cream of tartar, 2 DO, that means ditto, soda, quarter pound of lard, melt, and then she says melt, much more specific. Melt the butter and lard with the molasses until lukewarm, stirring all the time. 5 cups flour, beat the sugar and the eggs together until light. Yolks. 1 tablespoon ginger, add the whites, beat to a stiff froth, ice while warm. But you see, there's still missing. Beaten to a stiff froth, and then the next thing, ice when warm. Okay, but what about putting it in the oven, and what kind of pan and what temperature and for how long? Again, she's thinking, if you have my cookbook, you know about how long a cake should be in the oven. You know how hot a cake should be. I still remember my grandmother, my father's mother, sticking her hand into the oven to just get a sense of how hot it was, right? And how
Hmm.
long you could keep your hand in the oven told you about how hot it was, right? Keep it in for a little bit. Oh, it's okay. It's a medium oven. You have to take it out right away. Okay, it's a fast oven. It's a hot oven, right? So certain things go in at certain temperatures. So even with the more detailed instructions. She's still expecting you to know what size cake pan. There's a video I made when my book came out with me in my kitchen back in St. Louis with a sorry look, sorry looking gingerbread. It kind of looked like your kids, then when they make volcanoes in
Yes.
elementary school and they kind of rise up. I forget what they make out of them, but that's kind of what my gingerbread looked like. Because I thought I'm really going to come to the recipe like um, a complete novice.
Okay.
So I just guessed like what size pan, I guess. So it really looked like it really looked terrible. But there is a community of we'd say love amateurs in the sense of people who love, right? There's a Malinda Russell cook club. And I discovered,
Really?
yeah, you should look them up. I should have,
I am. I'm so excited
yeah,
about
and they
that.
have they have gone through the recipes. It's a community of cooks and they said, I can't show it to you because this is the radio, but look them up on the web. And they have gone through the cookbook and they have recreated the recipes. And they give you a little more sort of background. I think it started as a pandemic project, like so many projects, but going through the book, and then it was only available online. I think Michigan State had Michigan, so you could get, I think, Happy Trust, maybe Project Gutenberg. So a lot of things, there was the whole scanning revolution that started at the end of the 20th century. So they just took it upon themselves, I guess, in their different kitchens. We're all siloed in our kitchens and working on the recipes and saying these recipes really work. But having to step it back for those of us who aren't professional or quasi-professional chefs or very experienced chefs. Like her cream cake is really great. But these are some things that you might want to, you might need to know it works better with the 375 oven, or it might be better if you put it in a glass pan rather than a metal. Right? So you have this group of chefs helping you through. It's really a lovely thing.
Thank you for sharing that. I've enjoyed talking to you, Rafia. I'm so glad you had time to get up early this morning and chat
Yeah.
about Malinda Russell's cookbook and your forward in it. And if you have another book you ever want to come back, tell Lauren you want to come back on and we'll talk some more.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Even
It
though
was
I'm
a
thinking
pleasure.
it's coffee, I needed coffee. But I love talking to you. If you notice my background, for several years I taught at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Italy. So that's the castle the school is in, and I taught a course on Black diasporan food for them, for the Italians. And
Oh,
the
I love that.
yeah,
Oh, you are one of the most interesting women, so you must come back on and
all
spend
right.
some more time.
I'll write faster.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you for
You too,
having
and
me
have a good. Go get a
on.
good cup of coffee.
Okay. Take care. Bye
Take
bye.
care. Bye bye. Harry, I've been loving Publishers Week. Oh my goodness. All right, I'll be back tomorrow.